a glass to the past, and the ladies cross the ages, fallen fathers from the motherland whose lives are on the pages. And the bard who said it best when he told us all the world's a stage. So fellas, grab a glass and lift your spirits to the seventh age.
Welcome, one and all, to the Seven Ages Audio Journal. It's time once again to pour up a glass and pull up a chair as we gather together here in our favorite corner of the Crosstime Pub as we observe and remember the stories of cultures and of clashes that have occurred throughout the often tumultuous history of the Americas. Joining me, as always, are my cohorts and comrades, the boys of archaeology, James Waldo and Jason Pentrail. Gentlemen, how are we doing? And Jason, especially you, is the storm on your front doorstep yet?
The storm actually is literally on my front doorstep as we speak, but we're here, Crosstime Pub. I've got a Warsteiner here keeping me company. Don't really expect much from the storm, just moved back to lovely South Carolina doing house renovations, and just as I left it 4 years ago, it's time for more storms and hurricanes. That's what we do.
That is what you do, yeah. Well, I'm glad you're back down there on the coast, but I always worry when storm season arrives. James, I don't know if you got any of this bad weather up your way, but it was storming so loudly here that earlier when I was in here in my studio doing audio work, I had to actually stop. It was so noisy outside.
Well, we actually had a little bit of a thunderstorm here earlier in the Little Rock area, but I can tell you one thing that I don't miss this year is the East Coast and the storms that Jason has now. So I lived east of I-95, which is basically like marshland in between dry land and the ocean. So every year the question was, do we evacuate or not evacuate? I'm not playing that game this year, so that's good news.
Did you ever have to evacuate when you were in Savannah?
So every year that I was there, we had a mandatory evacuation at least one time. And I'm one of those people that doesn't normally evacuate unless the storm meets certain criteria that I set for myself. So when they do the mandatory evacuation, really what that means is you don't really have to leave, but if you need emergency services, they're not going to come.
Right.
So you have to, you got to roll your own dice. We didn't have kids at home, small children or anything. So, our risk tolerance was a little bit higher than I think, a lot of the people who live in our neighborhood.
Sure. Yeah. Well, Jason's the only one I have to worry about right now. Actually, that's not true because a lot of our friends in the archaeological community are down there in South Carolina. Wherever you may be, if you are along the East Coast right now, as we have storms developing out there over the Atlantic, please be careful. And if things get particularly hairy, definitely take every precaution that you need to. So guys, I've been following this big story involving the joint study out of Baylor University and Texas A&M University, where they have argued that sediment studies offer geochemical signatures that they believe, the researchers involved with this study, definitively explain the climate changes occurring during the Younger Dryas. We actually, here at Seven Ages, had some information in advance of this because, of course, of our contacts in the academic community, especially with relevance to the Younger Dryas and the impact hypothesis, which supposes that an impact or an airburst occurred around 12,800 years ago. This current study argues that, in fact, there may be a different mechanism which can explain the changes that were occurring in the ancient world around that time, and they attribute it mostly to volcanic eruptions, and further say that sediment studies seem to indicate that there were numerous similar occurrences that occurred in the years before and also after. I think going back as far as 15,000 years and certainly a few thousands of years after the Dryas event. And so the authors of this joint study between these two universities suggests something very contrary to the now very popular Younger Dryas impact hypothesis. Now, of course, if we're to look at this scientifically, we don't want to become married to any theory. So for my own part, and of course with a degree of foreknowledge that these results were forthcoming with relation to this study, I am intrigued by what they have found. But what I also wonder is whether the analysis of samples from a single location can completely refute the incredible amount of evidence that has been accumulating from sites all around the world. I am slightly concerned that it may be a bit premature to acknowledge the results of a single study at a single location, however much they appear to confirm one line of thought in terms of the mechanism that might account for the dry ice. And again, many have proposed volcanic eruptions over the years. That isn't per se a new idea. It is the case that this recent study from the cave in Texas is strongly in support of that idea, but does that refute all of the other evidence, the abundance, I think it's fair to say, of evidence from other locations that's accumulated over the last several decades from other locations around the world? I'm not entirely convinced that that is necessarily the case, but what I definitely do see here is the tendency, whether it's among academics or, laymen with pet theories, however much evidence there may be in support of any given idea, they tend to gravitate toward, I think, what they are predisposed toward believing or want to believe, and then they find the evidence that supports that. If we're to look at this problem more broadly, I wonder if all of the data at our disposal that indicates some pretty widespread climate changes occurring around 12,800 years ago, I wonder if all of that data suggests volcanoes. Do you guys, either of you, have thoughts about this study right now?
Yeah, so again, we're in that situation where we have, the majority of the evidence worldwide that does not necessarily support what they're presenting in this paper. It's interesting nonetheless. Like you said, we had a bit of foreknowledge knowing that this was coming down the pike, but it's one more piece in the puzzle. And I'm not here to say that it should be disregarded or that it's not important, because it is. Each part of this puzzle, if you will, plays a part, and it's important to continue these studies. It's important to look at all the evidence as it's being presented, and kind of look at it holistically, because this is not an easy thing to piece together. We're going back 13,000 years to try to retrofit this puzzle, and we only have, of 100 pieces, we may only have 10 pieces of the puzzle. So we're looking at this, and we're looking at it from different methods, different ways. But while this is very interesting, I don't support necessarily what's being presented, just because the abundance of evidence to the contrary has been presented over the last decade.
Certainly. And, something else that's kind of interesting to me is I recently picked up a copy of geologist James Lawrence Powell's book, Deadly Voyager, The Ancient Comet Strike That Changed Earth and Human History. And this book, of course, is the book that was cited by Mark Defont, the volcanologist, who had previously espoused some skepticism toward the impact hypothesis. After reading this book, he says, I really feel that now the abundance of evidence strongly favors the impact hypothesis. So I found it novel that a volcanologist who had been skeptical of the impact idea read Powell's book and now supports that idea. But now the latest study arguing against the impact theory actually proposes that volcanic activity can explain the climate changes occurring at that time. Now, a question I have long had, and actually there are some studies that at least make some associations. We should be careful, of course. Correlation does not necessarily mean causation, but there are some studies that link possible occurrences of volcano eruptions with impact events. It's not impossible that there might have been something that triggered a volcanic eruption around the time of the Dryas, and that there may have been a multitude of different elements that were contributing factors. Again, the verdict to me remains out on this. But again, referring back to the article about the study between Baylor and Texas A&M, they note that this work shows that the geochemical signature associated with the cooling event is not unique, but occurred 4 times between 9,000 and 15,000 years ago. This according to Alan Brandon, Ph.D., professor of geosciences at University of Houston. And he went on to say that thus the trigger for this cooling event didn't come from space. Prior geochemical evidence for a large meteor exploding in the atmosphere instead reflects a period of major volcanic eruptions. So this is the contention of the researchers with this study. I'm sure there will be more debate about this. I've already seen our good friend and colleague, Dr. Chris Moore, at work on Facebook discussing this over the last few days, and hopefully we can do a little more in the future in terms of discussing this. And even though we may be a good ways from resolving the ultimate cause, there's a lot of science to be done. And hey, you know what? I'm not going to get married to any theories right now. I am eager to see where this goes, but I want to see science applied to it.
Yeah, certainly. And I think one of the most important thing about this to me is there are a lot of smart people looking at this period in time that's, is really pivotal in human history. And this mystery is going to get solved. And I think it's exciting that so many people are, interested in this now. And what that really means is there's money available for the research on this. So we're going in the right direction here.
Well, in other news, gentlemen, I'd like to let the audience know that we have successfully rebounded from our epic 1-star review that we received. So I just want to take a moment here to thank a few people for taking a moment to write a nice review for us. So 5-star review from Girl That Curls, who says, "Great podcast. I, for one, love the opening song. Great singing. It reminds me of one of my favorite bands, Flogging Molly. It's a great podcast, too. Wish I could give it 10 stars. So thank you, Girl That Curls. We appreciate that. Also, Edie Marie writes, "Love the podcast. These guys are smart yet down to earth. The theme song fits the pub discussion atmosphere of the intro section. Check out Micah's band for some masterful string instrument performance, and that would be Nitro Grass if you're interested in checking that out. And I learned so much from every episode, partly due to the phenomenal scholarly guests. But I think my favorite thing of all is their careful visiting of subjects I encountered as a student when challenged with the dominant paradigm." And then finally, Connie writes with a 5-star review, "Heart, the theme song." That's 2 hearts, folks. And she says, "I love the theme. I wish it were even longer." So for all of you who took a couple minutes there to write a nice review for us, we certainly appreciate it. Rates and reviews are very important. So if you are listening out there, please take a moment to rate and review the show. That helps move us up the list so that other listeners can find the show. And it's a very important thing. Also, if you are interested, your business is interested in advertising on the 7 Ages Audio Journal, please contact me at Jason@7Ages, and I'll be happy to send you out one of our promo packages and let you know about the rates for advertising. That advertising revenue goes toward our direct research and to keep the cost of the podcast going. So if you're interested in doing so, please contact me at jason@7ages.org.
And, it may be apropos at the moment just to mention that, some of the kind of research that we're involved with, that funds that we receive, whether through fine advertisers like Occoquan Paleotechnics, who have supported this program, or through donations that you can make to us at 7ages.org. There's a donate button right there on the website. Those funds go toward research like something we've been involved with and hope to be more involved with in the next few weeks, although, of course, the pandemic situation has sort of slowed our progress. But we have recently volunteered to try and help analyze samples that some of our scientist friends are looking at with relation to this Younger Dryas question. Again, without leaping to conclusions or preconceptions about what the cause of the Younger Dryas was, there are scientists and they are trying to gather data. And often, like James said, it's very hard for them to do because there's a tremendous lack of funding. So something that the 7 Ages team, like we've got the time to do this either, guys, but we have offered to volunteer our time to help analyze samples. And it requires, of course, the purchase of some laboratory equipment, which, of course, is a labor of love. None of us are made of money. And until one of us becomes rich, it's going to be hard to be able to invest in the kind of equipment that we can use to help further the sciences. And so when Jason says we are funding our research, those aren't camping trips that we make to national parks or to famous public archaeological sites, although we like to visit a lot of those too. No, this is actual research that we are trying to do in order to aid our own friends in the scientific community. Call it citizen science, but often academicians are very underfunded, and there's a lot of research that has to be done. And I really advocate strongly people getting involved in avocational or citizen science studies, lending to the furtherance of our understanding of ancient mysteries or mysteries that remain in all the branches of the sciences. And so your support helps us to do that. And we thank so many of you guys who have shown support over the years, including George Howard, Christina Frawley, and also Edith Wacker, one of our new donators who has sent along some money in the furtherance of those objectives. So thanks to all you guys who continue to show support for what we do. We appreciate every one of you. And you can do that through donations, or you can do that through leaving reviews. And of course, you can follow us on social media. We're on iTunes, Twitter, YouTube, and of course, at our home on the web, 7ages.org. So, gentlemen, with all the news and announcements out of the way, I think it's about time for us to get to our interview. Another return appearance, which I'm very proud to announce. Dr. David Carballo, yet again of Boston University, joins us. He has an all-new book we are very eager to discuss with him. It's called Collision of Worlds, A Deep History of the Fall of Aztec Mexico and the Forging of New Spain. This, of course, is a very complex story, but I can't imagine any scholar more well-equipped to discuss this with us than Dr. David Carballo, who will join us next when we return right here on the 7 Ages Audio Journal. David Carballo is Associate Professor of Archaeology, Anthropology, and Latin American Studies at Boston University. His previous books include Urbanization and Religion in Ancient Central America. We've spoken with him on the past here on the program, and we are very excited about his latest book, Collision of Worlds, A Deep History of the Fall of Aztec Mexico and the Forging of New Spain, which we're going to discuss with him today. Welcome back again to the 7 Ages Audio Journal.
Thanks so much. It's great to be back. Within doing 2 again within a year, I loved the first experience so much. I was happy to sign up for another.
Well, we're delighted to have you. Delighted indeed.
Yeah, well, it's there's so much we didn't get to the first time as well, and we're excited to see that your content continues to grow. And with this new book that we've had a chance to preview, we're very excited about this new project, the release of this new book on Oxford University Press. So I want to begin right there. So this is a dynamic topic. It's something that we have covered briefly on the 7 Ages Audio Journal in the past, but something I noticed unique about your book and the writing is there is a focus on the deep time and a deep understanding of these cultures, which is something completely new to the discussion. So before we get into those fine details, let's begin with the origin of the book. So what was the inspiration? Why did you feel it was important to tell the story from that view of deep time?
Yeah, so the story of what is often called the Conquest of Mexico, now often termed the Spanish invasion of Mesoamerica, it has been written really in real time, starting with the conquistador Hernando Cortez himself and his letters that he was writing back, especially to his king, Carlos I or Charles I, and then by historians in the 16th century, joined with some native voices later in the 16th century as well, and then sort of brought to an Anglophone audience, in particular with works like William Prescott's in the 19th century. And onwards, and so it is this historical momentous encounter of 500 years ago, and we are right now in the middle of what most would see as the quincentennial 500th year anniversary of the pivotal events, which sort of frame 1519 to 1521, which is really the hostilities between the Spanish and the Aztecs, and so that we're sort of in the middle of that now, being in 2020. With that commemorative event coming up, my attention focused to it a little. It had always been there latent in my work. In fact, when I first got interested in Mesoamerican archaeology, I was very influenced by, this is in the early to mid 1990s. Hugh Thomas had a book called Conquest. He was a historian of Spain primarily, but covering lots of different periods and topics. And then also the Mexican writer Carlos Fuentes. He wrote, so in association with the quincentennial of Columbus, so 1992, this Mexican perspective on the transatlantic connections, the transatlantic roots of Mexico in particular. And those, when I was just getting into the topic, those were books that were very influential to me and got me interested. But I really then had a career, as you know, that's more focused on pre-Hispanic times and on places like Teotihuacan, the great pre-Aztec capital in central Mexico, but also working in the state of Tlaxcala. And so being in Tlaxcala for over a decade doing research on an earlier period got me interested in conquest history, because the Tlaxcalteca, of course, were the key native allies to the Spaniards. There are other native groups that joined the Spanish. There were some Totonacs, the Acolwa, which were the group from Texcoco, which was the second largest city-state of the Aztec Triple Alliance, which we know as the Aztec Empire. But being in Tlaxcala, as they were seen as these loyal allies, and presented themselves in the 16th century as such, they had a period of autonomy as an Indian republic, where they weren't paying tax to the Spanish crown, for instance, and really, other than a few priests, there wasn't much Spanish presence, and so that really fascinated me, reading more about that history and doing excavations again on an earlier time period, but then having Aztec period and conquest period and early colonial period deposits as well that we were sorting through. Got me interested in the entrada, or the entry that the Spanish caravan, now with some native allies from Veracruz, Totonacs, into Tlaxcala, and forging that pivotal alliance. So that was sort of my academic background that interested me in this topic. And I'd say also on a personal level, I have a transatlantic family. My paternal grandparents fled Spain during the Civil War, fleeing Franco, the dictator, and came to Cuba, and got married in Cuba. And some of their brothers and sisters, some stayed behind in Spain, and others were part of the diaspora of that Civil War, and went to Venezuela, Uruguay, some in Cuba, some in Florida, and mine happened to end up in New York. And so my own background includes that transatlantic history, and it's always been interesting to me of seeing the deep roots in the Iberian Peninsula and in Mexico, and how they came together 500 years ago.
Yeah, that must be very interesting to be able to have that personal connection. That's something I really appreciate about the new book, is so many photographs and visuals that you provide, which are those which you acquired yourself having gone to these places. And of course, working with archaeology in Mesoamerica, naturally you're going to be there, but you also made the trip across the pond. And so you're providing us a unique perspective, both visually and intellectually, on all of this. Let's go back 5 centuries ago in Mexico with the fall of the Aztec Empire. What are some of the dynamics leading up to your main focus in this book, and the interactions between these cultures occurring prior to the war that begins in 1519?
So Mesoamerica of, say, the early 16th century is not unified as one single cultural sphere or one single political formation, but the most dominant polity or empire was what we know as the Aztec Empire. And we can unpack terms like Aztec. I'm using them for simplicity and communication. The dominant ethnic group was the Mexica, and we get the term Mexico from Mexica. But they were in alliance. The Mexica of Tenochtitlan, which was the largest city in the Western Hemisphere at the time, was in alliance with 2 other city-states, Texcoco and Tlacopan, which had their own sort of ethnic roots, but we gloss all of them as Aztec, meaning that they're people who saw their ancestry as coming from migrations from Aztlan, somewhere to the northwest of central Mexico, of some debated origin. But that the ethnonym Aztec comes from that those migration narratives. And so that was the largest polity, but it wasn't the only one. To the west was a large empire known as the Tarascan or Purépecha Empire, which was a rival of the Aztecs. And within the midst of the greater Aztec cultural sphere of central Mexico, extending to both coasts and a little to the south, was Tlaxcala. And the Tlaxcalteca, as I mentioned, were the main rivals of the empire. They were not unified into the Triple Alliance Empire. They were, even though they were, culturally very similar, they spoke Nahuatl, or that was the dominant language. Secondarily, there was Otomi, which is another language of central Mexico. And so they were at odds and resisting the Aztec Empire. To the east, then, were other groups, especially when you head down into the lowlands. So Western Mesoamerica is more mountainous and high plains. And then you head into the Gulf of Mexico region and you get into humid lowlands with groups like the Totonacs. And then further east, different Mayan groups, and that includes the Chontal, which were traders in the Yucatan Peninsula, connecting the Gulf of Mexico into the Caribbean, and then the Yucatec Maya, who were more on the peninsula side to the north. And those were the groups that the first Spaniards arriving in the area encountered. And in fact, one of the amazing side stories of this larger encounter is that there were some Maroons that had ended up in the Yucatan Peninsula prior to any of these formal expeditions. So there was Francisco de Aguilar and Gonzalo Guerrero, who ended up marooned in the Yucatan Peninsula and taken in by a Maya community. And Aguilar was maintained his Spanish identity, and he saw himself as living among quote unquote heathens, whereas Guerrero adopted to Maya life, and he married a Maya princess of that community. Her name was Azilha, and had children. And so and he's sort of viewed as a figure that. Or their pairing that created mestizaje, the mixing of indigenous and Spanish roots. There were two expeditions prior to Cortez's, but when Cortez arrived, he had heard of these Maroons and then wanted to track them down for information and on the native cultures. And Aguilar did join him and then became part of this chain of communication, which included a character I assume we'll get to later, La Malinche or Malinsli, who could navigate between Nahuatl and Mayan, whereas Aguilar could speak Mayan and Castilian Spanish. And that's the way that this encounter and invasion could be mediated through this elaborate game of telephone between these four actors.
That makes it so much more interesting, the dynamic, because there was the ability to communicate based on the previous immersion into the culture of these Maroons. And that makes it, again, one of the most interesting historical examples of a clash between cultures. They actually were able to communicate to an extent. And of course, there were so many dynamics going on here. One of the things that you also focus on in the book has to do with the sorts of cultural developments that are occurring independently, and also at times there are similarities between the different cultures prior to their interaction. Let's contrast and compare the similarities between what we're seeing in different parts of the world on either side of the Atlantic, and then also some of the similarities that arise prior to their actual contact.
Yeah. So one thing I wanted to do in the book, I think, stepping back and it gets a little to your first question of this sort of materially grounded deep history perspective. And I mentioned there's been many accounts of this event or this chapter in human history, but mostly told within a concise 3 to 10-year interval around what would be considered the main conflict. And so, my approach as an archaeologist and having worked on, much earlier chapters of Mesoamerican history, going back to sort of the first autonomous farming communities up into the Aztec Empire and this encounter, was then to think about, where are all of, like, when we think of the key variables of the encounter that the Spanish arrived on boats with horses and steel weapons and this sort of conquistador ethos. Where did that all come from? What are the roots of that go back in time? And likewise, when we look at Mesoamerican cultures and their ethnic distribution and the fact how they affiliated with their particular city-state and who might ally with the Spaniards and who might not, all of that has a deeper history than just the few-year interval. So to be able to do that, I spend two separate chapters, one looking at the deep history of Mesoamerica, which we've talked about a little, and another then looking at the deep history of Iberia. And in both cases, we start with agriculture and those archaeological questions of what are the crops that were domesticated in different areas, and what was the tempo of that process? How did it lead to settled or sedentary farming communities? And both areas, of course, had domesticated crops. One major difference, though, was the lack of animals, especially pack animals in Mesoamerica, in the Americas in general. So there just were not animals that lent themselves to domestication. Pack animals only in the Andes, the camelids, the llamas, and alpacas, and then smaller animals like dogs and turkeys in the case of Mesoamerica. Of course, that's why we eat turkey on Thanksgiving in the United States, is that sort of legacy. In Mesoamerica, agriculture arose autonomously for the most part. The main sort of staple crops of maize, more than anything, was originated in southwestern Mexico and took many millennia to reach the sort of cob size that we associate with corn today. And so there was a slowly unfolding process of the Archaic period into settled farming communities. The history was different in Iberia because in Iberia, largely crops arrived as an import from the Fertile Crescent region of Southwest Asia. And so wheat, barley, and the different pulses came from that initial earlier domestication event in the Fertile Crescent, and along with animals, with domesticated animals. So this explains some of the differences between the two areas in terms of the tempo of social developments, from farming communities to urban societies and the like. It also has significant differences in terms of animal traction. So something that some of my colleagues have explored is what happens with animal plowing, for instance, allows for large-scale extensive agricultural plots that then also can work to consolidate wealth in terms of land differentially and lead to heightened inequality, which is something that happened more in old world history, especially in Eurasia, where there was plow animals, compared to in Mesoamerica, where we do have intensive agriculture, but not using animals. So things like the Aztec chinampas were more about intensifying existing plots, smaller plots, and getting more crops out of them, rather than plowing to have more fields that then opens up more land for crops, which would be extensive agriculture. And likewise, there was the cavalry that was part of Eurasian warfare, the ramp up in metals technologies, that the way that we frame Eurasian history is often in terms of technological change. So a Stone Age leading to a Bronze Age to an Iron Age, etc. That didn't happen to the same degree in the Americas. In Mesoamerica, there was bronze technologies more to the west of the Aztec core, but there wasn't that same sort of arms race ramp up in technology, in naval capabilities. And so, for instance, to the question of looking at differences in naval history between the two areas, I do focus on Iberia's sort of geographical role as a hinge between the Mediterranean world and the Atlantic world, and a lot of the shipbuilding technologies that both the Spanish and Portuguese leveraged in the 15th and 16th century was a marrying of these two traditions, that there was the Mediterranean component and the Atlantic component, and in sort of hull construction and types of masts and rigging, that was a blending of these. It was a hybrid tradition in this peninsula. And even going back much farther than that, we can look at the Phoenicians who first arrived on the southern shores of Iberia, and then waves of colonizers, the Carthaginians, the Romans, the Islamic invasion, and the Iberia has this history of just waves of different invasions, and it was a battleground for so many millennia, and so looking at those two trajectories in tandem, there are other authors who have done this sort of on a global scale. When you think about, sort of these big histories of the history of humanity. And in this book, I preferred to take a more intermediate scale, where I'm somewhere between the sort of focused history of, we're just going to look at these couple decades, say, or even smaller interval of years around the conquest. In this case, we're temporally looking at at least 3 millennia, but also very much focused just on these two areas, and so more intermediate in scope than the sort of global histories explaining history of humankind from human evolution up till present. That's a much wider net.
Indeed.
Yeah, Dr. Carballo, as we begin to get to the portion of the conversation where these larger than life personalities of Moctezuma and Cortez actually meet, and we get into the details of that, again, because so much of the book is devoted to that earlier understanding. One more area I want to delve into before we get to the main portion of that conversation is philosophy and religious stance, because these two things are always central to conquesting armies, if you will, cultures. They're always paramount to the discussion. So what similarities and differences, for that matter, do we see between the Mesoamerican cultures and the Iberian cultures coming across?
Yeah. So I do look in, especially in chapter 4, where I'm explicitly setting up some connections between the, what are parallels and what are differences between these two major culture areas. There are some striking similarities, for instance, in the use of patron deities or patron saints. So I look in Iberia, the militarization of St. James or Santiago, who goes from, sort of a wandering apostle figure depicted holding a staff and being more peaceful, to becoming Santiago the Moor Slayer, Matamoros, and then who comes to the so-called Indies or the Americas and is Mata Indios, like that he's a conqueror. The Aztecs also had, conquering patron deity, the Mexica in particular. Huitzilopochtli was a divine leader or tutelary god for the Mexica as a people, and was associated with the sun and with warfare, and the ethnic group, the Mexica, and some of the migration narrative also conflates these attributes, where Huitzilopochtli is the sun dispatching the night sky metaphorically in one episode, but he's also sort of a leader of his people and brings the Mexica from Aztlan and eventually to Tenochtitlan. So those similarities are very interesting. There's some similarities in just the origin narratives as a whole. I think a trope almost universally for imperial narratives are some mix of the civilized barbarians. So this mix of we have the right to rule because we can draw on this history of earlier civilizations in the area. We are legitimate, but at the same time, we pulled ourselves up from our bootstraps and we struggled, and we're a force to be reckoned with. And that we see in both. We can talk about ancient Rome had this, and the Mexica certainly did, and Castilian Spain did, and I'd even argue the U.S. has its own variant on that. And so there are those interesting parallels. At the same time, there are certainly differences. And so one of the most striking is how through the period that is framed later, and there are problems to the term, but the Reconquista, what the Christian forces on the Iberian Peninsula, after hundreds of years of battles with Islamic forces, then saw as a retaking of "quote unquote" their peninsula, that gave a brand of Christianity or Catholicism that was very absolutive. It was, fundamentalist. It was this or nothing. Where in Mesoamerica, conquest, any sort of political conquest, religiously was involved more incorporation, more accommodation. And so I would see Aztec religion as incorporative. An example of this would be in Tenochtitlan. There's the Coat-Teocalli, which is the sort of serpent God's house, and they use this term serpent as this reciprocal understanding, like we think of a snaking draft or something like this, back and forth motion. That's where the images of other patron deities that then were incorporated into the Aztec Empire would be housed, and they were housed in a respectful way. And it probably is also one of the reasons why in central Mexico, the recognizable deities, or what we might call a pantheon, seems to just keep expanding. So in Teotihuacan, there's a certain number of gods we can recognize. There's more in the Toltec period, and there's even more in the Aztec period, as people were coming into contact with each other or conquering each other, and just basically expropriating that divine image. And that's quite different than 16th century Castilian brand of Catholicism, which was much more fundamentalist and absolutist.
Yeah. While we're on the topic of religion, maybe it would be good to interject here. One of the focuses also in your new book, Collision of Worlds, published by Oxford University Press. And of course, so everyone will want to check this out, arguably going to be on the fast path to being the authoritative historical account of this clash between cultures. But something, David, that I'd like to look at with you in relation to religion is some of the myths that you address in the book. And I think that one area from which these perhaps arise has to do with the very Catholicized or Christianized worldview brought by the Spanish to the New World, and then their interpretation of certain culture and other aspects of the belief systems in the New World that they arrived in. And of course, there is that old expression, history is written by the victors. But in this case, we have to remember that when we are looking at the actual history that we have available, the written history absolutely has a bias and a slanted perspective. Let's maybe talk a bit about that too.
Sure. Yeah. Right. So, of course, the adage, history is written by the winners. History always comes with the bias of the author. And so probing the sources, one always has to keep in mind, why were they writing this? What was the motivation for them to write? With Cortez, it's pretty clear, he was actually had breached the chain of command. He was not authorized to invade as he did. He was not given the title of adelantado, the front man who was authorized to see out this invasion. His superior, Diego de Velázquez, who was the governor of Cuba and the Indies, he was the one who was authorized to do any sort of invasion like this. And so he only allowed Cortez to go and explore the Mesoamerican coasts after Cordoba and Grijalva, two earlier explorers, had also done the same. And so Cortez is writing directly back to the king, Charles I, not to his superior Velázquez, trying to justify why he's doing this. And so that he had breached this chain of command, essentially. And so we often have to look at the exploits, what the size of the armies he's claiming to have conquered, how heathen the native peoples were, because these were all things that he could use to justify this illegal invasion he was undertaking. A number of other conquistadors then start writing, but they do this in the 1540s, or at least starting then, because Spain had passed these new laws. So after the conquest, many of the conquistadors received estates, encomiendas, where they had landed estates with a labor force of native peoples, and these laws, the new laws in 1542, start reducing the power of those encomiendas. And so these former conquistadors then are trying to justify essentially why they should be able to hold on to them. So they have this new rationale, but they might write in a way that also tries to decenter the narrative from Cortez, because after Cortez's letters, which were hot sellers back in Europe at the time, There was then other historians, most famously Lopez de Gomara, who was Cortez's secretary and chaplain, and wrote a sort of a longer, more fleshed out history of this based on Cortez's own letters. And Gomara claims interviews with Cortez. But it really fashions the first clear great man narrative of this, portraying Cortez as a saint-like figure for conquering these heathen forces and expanding Christianity. And so any then later history that's drawing on Gomara, you have to really doubt the aims of that author and not probing other sources and seeing how to problematize that particular bias. So we do, for instance, then have a lot of native sources, a lot of sources written by former Aztec and other ethnic group elites, some of whom could have been eyewitnesses or at least were then children of key actors during the period, and they're secondary sources in the same family line. So they're drawing on oral traditions within their families. They contain their own forms of bias, and it's because those native authors usually were trying to promote the either what their ancestors did, their particular lineage or their particular city state. So what the people of Tlaxcala say is very different than from what the people of Texcoco or Tlatelolco, these other city states, say. So we have to take in that sort of both lineage-based and ethnic city-state bias in those sources. And then finally, I'd say within the Spanish sources, there is quite an interesting contrast between the conquistador sources and the friars. And I probe a little of this difference going back to their training. Many of these men were educated at the University of Salamanca in Spain. And so one of the fun side projects for this was then poring over documents from the 16th and early 17th centuries from that university, and they have wonderful archives. And I was, assisted by the librarian who pointed me to a whole number of sources that basically give you what the curriculum was for different degrees at the time within the University of Salamanca, and just seeing the difference between what Cortez, who studied law there for 2 years before dropping out, he had a sort of very vocational training, and this is just sort of the nuts and bolts of biblical law, of Roman law, and of the sort of current Spanish bureaucratic system as a baseline for becoming what was called a man of letters, or a letrado, so to be part of this new imperial bureaucracy. And it was very different than what the friars were reading, who had a much more broad arts and science, philosophical type training that included a lot of the great classical works, Aquinas and other Christian authors. They're more sort of, and I think trained them to largely, and there are exceptions to this, but to be more empathetic to native peoples and in considering their role within world and biblical history, to develop sort of pseudo-ethnographic approaches and learn indigenous languages. So people like Bernardino de Sahagún and Toribio de Benavente, who are known as Motolinia, they learned Nahuatl, and they worked closely with Nahuas, who then also learned Castilian and Latin. And so you have this trilingual incipient academic culture of the mid-16th century in Mexico, which is really fascinating, and some of the richest sources that let us know about Aztec life of the time and the conquest come from that.
Absolutely. One of the things also that's really fascinating is looking at those primary sources, seeing how these two groups saw one another. If you wouldn't mind, maybe I could actually share this quote from Cortez describing his first encounter with Moctezuma. He says, "He came to greet us, and with him some 200 lords, all barefoot and dressed in a different costume, but also very rich in their way, and more so than the others. They came in 2 columns, pressed very close to the walls of the street, which is very wide and beautiful, and so straight that you can see from one end to the other. Moctezuma came down the middle of this street with 2 chiefs, one on his right, the other on his left, and they were all dressed alike except that Moctezuma wore sandals, whereas the others went barefoot, and they all held his arm on either side." I'd like to ask you, what does this imagery, this image, tell us about the way that Cortez first perceives the ruler of the area that he is now entering and soon will topple?
Yeah, it's wonderfully evocative. What Cortez wrote, Bernal Diaz, who another conquistador, wrote a much longer history, but later he evokes the great chivalric romance of the time, Amadis of Gaul, and that was like a book that was I guess for a conquistador of the time would have been like, I don't know, reading a Western, for mid 20th century American, that this is sort of like this romantic conquering type spirit, and Bernal Diaz evokes that as he's walking up one of these causeways. And so what Cortez is probably referring to there, being a very wide street, were the causeways that connected this island capital, Tenochtitlan, to the mainland. And Moctezuma gathered other speakers. So that's a general term for leader of other city-states, other court members, and from Cortez's arrival on the coast of Veracruz was giving offerings or making tribute to him, largely hoping they would just turn around and go away. I mean, within the norms of Mesoamerican warfare, you could just initiate tributary relations and get out of any hostilities. And so, a lot of these elaborate garments that Moctezuma was then having porters bring all the way to the coast and throughout the trek inland to the capital were filled of very fine textiles, very fine feather work, mosaic work. So Moctezuma himself would have been wearing this turquoise mosaic diadem, which was the sort of crown of high office of Aztec peoples, and Cortez was interested in these goods, and rather than turn around, especially seeing things like the gold, whet his appetite and the Spaniards' appetite for conquest, and kept them moving inward. And one thing I'd like to, since this is again a book focused on material culture, is look at some of the differences in systems of valuation, and that Mesoamericans they really valued products that were green blue, and so that would include jade as the precious stone, and then later turquoise. Later in Mesoamerican history, there becomes a brisk turquoise trade with the American Southwest and with northwestern Mexico, and for them those were the most valuable mineral resources. And then add to that some beautiful tropical bird feathers, first and foremost among them the quetzal, that lives in the cloud forest of Mesoamerica, and a very reclusive bird, and has a few of these long tail feathers that would go into very elaborate headdresses for god impersonators and other high figures like that. So they really valued those goods, and the Spanish didn't to that degree. I mean, they did value feather work, and in fact, it's interesting. In the early colonial period, there becomes this art form that essentially is called feather painting, and it's sort of like fine feather mosaic work, but that with new Christian images that are part of the colonial period. So Europeans did value that craftsmanship, but really the Spaniards are hell-bent on finding gold resources. And again, that story goes back millennia on the Iberian Peninsula. So I talk a little bit about the Carthaginians looking for, well, first the Phoenicians and the Carthaginians conquering for mineral resources, and then the Punic Wars with Rome overtaking Carthage's southern resources and continuing to expand into the northwest. And why they do that is that for a while the richest gold mine of the Roman Empire was in northwestern Iberia, and the sort of final wars there extracted that gold. And so that valuation, that cultural economy around this particular substance has a deep history, and so does the fact that Mesoamericans valued jade. And so what the Spaniards would often do then was trade green glass beads, and they saw this now as a currency that really worked in Mesoamerica. How would you get native peoples to help with transport. For instance, Aguilar, when he comes to meet Cortez, he says, I had a few jade or green glass beads with me to pay for my portage over to the expedition. And likewise, Bernal Diaz, when they're being expelled from Tenochtitlan in what's known as the Noche Triste, he says, I had the good foresight to take some jade beads because I knew this would be a valuable currency, unlike my compatriots who are weighing themselves down with gold, which would essentially be useless. So those little fascinating differences in ways of seeing value come out in these encounters.
A lot is focused around, I think, the personalities, these large personalities. So when we look at the leadership on both sides of this conquest and conflict, I think it's important to understand the strategies and to understand the personality types, if you will. So through this previous discussion on the valuation, we see what was important as far as a movable currency between the two. But when we look at these two large personalities and also the subsidiary personalities, the people that were working below the two leaders, what do we see when we compare and contrast as far as strategy and personality type between the two leaders?
Yeah, so so there's what we think of as the sort of main male actors, which would be like Cortez and Moctezuma, and that in and of itself is interesting to me. That I think the Spanish often, for various reasons. One is that they're coming from this late medieval tradition of certain ideas of dynasties and governance, and identifying a king. And then secondly, it was easier diplomatically for them to just deal with one person rather than multiple decision makers. And so they're often trying to sort out, all right, who's the main guy to speak to here? And I think that has actually skewed some of our understanding of native political organization before the conquest. And some of my colleagues, especially working in Tlaxcala, which didn't have a single ruler. It had this, a co-rule system, and it had a very strong what we might call Senate or noble council that made major decisions on behalf of that city-state, including to then eventually ally with the Spanish. After fighting with them for 20 days, there was a period of conflict first. And so thinking of that, of multiple strategies here of native peoples, of women, and the most famous here being Malinche, who again is a bilingual speaker who is at the boundary of the Aztec and Maya worlds, and when she as a young child is basically sold into slavery, and then after fights with the Spanish, then is gifted to Cortez's expedition, and so within this very structured hierarchical system, which deprives her of agency, takes it on herself to speak up and say that she can translate, and take this very active role in events that changed history. Dona Luisa Xicontecatl, she's the daughter of one of the main personages of Tlaxcala, and the person that Cortez actually identifies most as like a key decision maker, even though he was one of many. But she's the daughter of him, and is then gifted to Alvarado, who is the second in command behind Cortez, and in some ways even more cruel and infamous for his conquests in Guatemala, in the Highland Maya area. But she travels with Alvarado to Guatemala, and even goes with him to Ecuador when Alvarado thinks he can conquer the Inca Empire, get in on that. And so, these interesting figures who are really part of global events, global history, the creation of a globalized world, and being constrained by structures of oppression and sexism and classism and racism, but then finding a voice, finding a niche within this new reality. And that of course sums up so much of both the encounter and its aftermath in the early colonial period as people are negotiating their roles within this new world order. And so, like the Tlaxcalteca made 5 or 6 expeditions back to Spain. So these native peoples are, getting on boats in Veracruz and ending up in Spain to plead their case of why they should have autonomy, why they were loyal to the crown, and even in one of the historians I talk about, Diego Muñoz Camargo, who's a mestizo from Tlaxcala, he presents this history he had written of his native Tlaxcala to Philip II, who's then king of Spain in the later 16th century, and he's telling his story and bringing it to this new foreign capital, this colonizing power across the ocean.
You hit on so many important points right there, and what I'd like to emphasize, and which is a theme that recurs throughout your book, is the idea that we are seeing really the beginnings of a globalized world emerge from this dynamic in this period. And this would not only set the stage for world relations for centuries to come, but again, it would fundamentally redefine the ways that cultures interacted with one another. This was a pivotal moment, and I really think that should be emphasized as you do throughout your book.
Yeah, I do see this as, in a significant way, the roots of the creation of the global world order we think about. And, of course, there are plenty of historians that can debate exactly what is globalization and when does it start. And at some level, it has to require the whole globe being involved, right? And or the major land masses at least. And so, you can't really talk about true globalization until you include the Americas, although there are other works that, and archaeologists have even used this term for much more constrained spheres, but it's using, I would say, globalization within scare quotes, that you're talking about really, wide interaction networks, but they are not involving the whole globe. But with the invasion of Mesoamerica and the eventual creation of New Spain, that created a new jumping off point that linked the Atlantic and Pacific worlds, and most importantly with the establishment of the Manila galleon in the 1560s, where then you had boats sailing from Acapulco to the Philippines with Chinese traders living in the district of Parian in Manila, bringing back goods that then went to Mexico City. And they're one of the markets where it's actually called the Parian Market because it had goods from Asia. And then they were transshipped over Mexico into Veracruz, into the Gulf, and then they came out into the European economy. Thinking about that as like linking, both oceans through the Americas. And we have this wonderful document from a native historian named Chimalpahin writing in the early 1600s, and he's writing about Japanese emissaries in Mexico City coming and meeting with Spaniards, and he is a Nahuatl speaker. So you have this linkage between Europe and Asia mediated through a Native American historian. To me, that's truly global history then.
Absolutely. I guess we, at this point, can get into the heart of the conflict, which is occurring between 1519 and 1521. There are a lot of dynamics leading up to this. I think we've established a lot of the dynamics, including economics, cultural, and historical ideas, even going back into deep history. Let's talk about the primary conflict and how this shakes out and what the dynamics of that conflict are, as well as the result.
Yeah, so really it starts with first navigating down the Yucatecan coast in the Maya area with shorter conflicts with different Mayan groups, and then settling more permanently in Veracruz on the coast of the Gulf of Mexico. And there, one of the key sites is called Sempoala, and it was a Totonac site, Totonac as being the ethno-linguistic group, but it was part of the Aztec Empire. there are a number of conflicts there, but then also alliance that provides some of Cortez's first native allies, mostly as scouts and porters, as then they move inland. As they move inland, they're coming from this hot and humid tropical coast up into 1.5 miles above sea level into these high plains. It is the altiplano, the high plains of central Mexico. And it's also the Totonacs who tell the Spaniards of the Tlaxcalans or Tlaxcalteca, who and the fact that they were enemies of the Aztec Empire, that they weren't allied or they weren't part of the empire. And so that puts the seed in Cortez's head that he could find more native allies in Tlaxcala. The entry into Tlaxcala, again, is fascinating for me because I happened to do archaeological digs in the region for a number of years. And so there's a mix between Nahuatl-speaking populations and Otomi-speaking populations. To the north of the state were more Otomi populations, and those are the ones that the Spanish and a few Totonacs first encounter and fight with. And there's quite hostile encounters, first with the Otomis, then with the Nahuatl-speaking Tlaxcalteca a little farther south in the center of the state. And this was really interesting too, thinking about this initial sort of not quite a month, but a couple weeks of hostile encounters, because in the colonial documents, of course, the Tlaxcalteca are portraying themselves as always loyal, right? That they immediately allied with the Spanish, but here they really resisted for a while, and then saw their opportunity to change the political order, which was not working in their favor, and make this strategic alliance with the Spanish. And they first went to Cholula, which had been allies with the Tlaxcalteca, but then had become part of the Triple Alliance and enemies. And there is, this famous or infamous massacre in Cholula, where the killing of unarmed citizens of that city-state, which was one of the most glorious and historically rich of Mesoamerica. It had, for 1,500 years prior, always been the central seat of both religion for pilgrimage and a market center, and it continued to have that role. It had the biggest pyramid to the god Quetzalcoatl, or the feathered serpent, and so that particular massacre, which I also start the book with a little bit, looking at this deep history framed through Cholula and Cortez's hometown of Medellin, because those two sites have such layered, visible deep history when you go and visit them. Following that, then they come into the basin of Mexico, and that involves crossing very high volcanoes, snow-capped volcanoes, and coming down and seeing the pretty remarkable urban core of the Aztec Empire, including Tenochtitlan, which at the time was larger than any city in the Iberian Peninsula and maybe Europe, or it might have been tied with Paris. But this massive city and so well planned, like the quote that you read earlier from Cortez, so well organized, they were quite wowed by it. And Moctezuma receives them into his capital, and there are months of being there, this uneasy period, which some conquistadors just dismiss as and we were there for 8 months, and they don't give you much more detail, whereas others are explaining from their perspective what the city looked like, the fact that human sacrifice horrified them, and there was this big skull rack, which is now archaeologically documented near the main temple, so we actually get a lot of the rich textual history that complements the archaeology of Tenochtitlan from this interval of months that the Spaniards were in the city. Things turn sour, starting with a massacre when Cortez goes to quell a sort of Spanish insurrection, yet led by someone named Narvaez, who arrives in the coast of Veracruz and was sent by that governor Velasquez, who hadn't authorized Cortez to invade. And so this is basically to bring the expedition back. So Cortez is gone. He leaves Alvarado in command, and this is during a very holy period in the Aztec calendar called Toshkat. And during that, there's a massacre in the sacred precinct of Tenochtitlan, and that makes the situation very tense. And Cortez re-enters the city. In the meantime, probably sometime during this interval, so do really devastating diseases like smallpox. They enter Mexico with the Narvaez expedition, and this has a devastating effect on the indigenous population. Again, this goes back to the deep history, the fact that Iberians, like other Eurasians, had lived in urban centers longer and lived with domesticated animals who transfer diseases, as we know very well in this particular moment we're living through, that then become pandemics, and native populations didn't have this genetic resistance to these particular diseases, and so and this ends up with widespread death. And anywhere estimates range of the percentage, but after several decades, it could have been on the order of 80 to 90% of the native population succumbed to diseases. That happens at this interval as well. But the Mexica do expel the Spaniards from the city in what's known by the Spaniards as the sad night, Noche Triste, and they then have to go reconvene in Tlaxcala and mount a new attack against the capital. And in that, there's a few important developments. First, there's an alliance with Texcoco, who again was the second largest city-state in the Triple Alliance. And so now having that new group of allies also gives them a port on the lakes to launch brigantines. So these, masted European-style vessels not seen before in central Mexico, with falconets, small cannons on them, that can then launch a naval battle, a Eurasian-style naval battle against the Aztec capital, as well as the possibility of laying siege to the city, which, given the military technologies of Mesoamerican warfare never occurred, or at least on this degree. And so, as Cortez and other conquistadors were walking into the city, the first time they could see it was fed by a couple of aqueducts, fresh water. And so that obviously strategically is something to destroy, so that cut the city off from its water source, and have this siege, including naval warfare and ground warfare with cavalry on different sides of the capital. Eventually, the last great speaker of the Mexica, Cuauhtémoc, Moctezuma, had died, and even Cuitláhuac, who is a next in command after Moctezuma, who died probably of smallpox, so he was affected directly by disease. Cuauhtémoc then becomes the last sovereign of the Mexica, and he surrenders in Tlatelolco to Cortez, and that sort of ends that chapter. And some histories of the conquest could end there pretty much. And I think there are resonances of this up into present, and some of that is we see in people rethinking history, rethinking monuments, rethinking how we commemorate these historical events, sometimes very fraught, sometimes very challenging in the present. But also, what are our connections with our neighbor to the south in Mexico, and those issues of the long and deep history of connections between what is now the U.S. versus Mesoamerica, and issues of migration, issues of intercultural understanding. I do hope this book helps in that regard of being familiar with our neighbors to the south and the deep and fascinating history of Mexico.
Absolutely. Well, Dr. Carballo, thank you again for joining us today. It's always a pleasure to speak with you. Much success with this book. And of course, I hope we will speak with you again. I'm sure we will in the future here on the 7 Ages Audio Journal.
Thanks, Micah and Jason. It's been wonderful again. Real pleasure. thanks to everyone for listening, too.
Special thanks again to Dr. David Carballo. His book, Collision of Worlds, A Deep History of the Fall of Aztec Mexico and the Forging of New Spain, will be linked in the show notes. Please consider supporting his work, purchase this book, and definitely read his perspectives on, again, I think what has become and will be remembered as the definitive history of this very troubling time in American history. And that book is made available online by Oxford University Press. It just goes to show, and this kind of goes back to one of the points made by one of the recent reviewers that you mentioned in the first segment of the show, Jason, that not all the aspects of history that we discuss or that we learn about in school are easy to discuss or to digest as times change, and of course so do we, as social changes and cultural changes occur. And it can be very painful at times to have to look back at the past and see where we came from, but I think it is so very important that when we do, we get a clear picture of what that past actually was, and not merely the history written by the victors, as it were. So Dr. Carballo's work is so wonderful and very important. And of course, in the coming months, we will have additional discussions of equal importance on this program. I don't think it's too early to announce that we'll have another return appearance in the coming months, and that will be none other than James Adovasio, one of our very favorite scholars and arguably one of my biggest influences when it comes to archaeology. I cannot wait to speak with Dr. Adovasio again, who we met and who gave us graciously an entire afternoon of his time at Meadowcroft Rock Shelter on one of our very first research outings with the 7 Ages Research Associates. So it's going to kind of be like a homecoming having him back here, this time joining us in the pub. I knew he liked scotch.
Yes, indeed. And that was the very first stop on our first 7 Ages road trip. So we all remember that fondly. And he took a lot of time for us to film that video documentary, and we certainly appreciate that. So we're looking forward to having him back for the second installment of the Legacy series, and that'll be coming up here shortly in just a month or two, and we're looking forward to having him back.
I certainly agree, and the last time that we spoke, the conversation was almost exclusive to the Meadowcroft Rock Shelter, but with his extensive knowledge of ancient basketry and netting, and of course, books he's written like The Invisible Sex, where he looks at the role of women in archaeology in ancient times. Again, he is someone who has been a pivotal figure in reshaping our understanding of the ancient past, and we have so much more to discuss with him. So that's something to look forward to. And of course, many more fine conversations that'll be coming in the weeks ahead here on this program. But guys, for right now, I think that just about wraps it up. James, old buddy, old pal, would you join me over here at the Cross Time Pub for just one more round, my friend?
Well, just one more, Micah.
Yeah.
Just one more.
Just one more. Only, of course, if Jason joins us too, right?
Well, I'm already here, guys, so let's do this thing.
Let's do it. All right, on behalf of all of us here, the 7 Ages Research Associates, thanks again to Oxford University Press and Dr. David Carballo. We will see you again next time right here on this podcast. Be sure and follow us online at 7ages.org. And on behalf of James Waldo, Jason Pentrail, and yours truly, Micah Hanks, we are the 7 Ages Research Associates, and we'll catch you again next time right here on the 7 Ages Audio Journal.